Sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry are the secrets we keep for others. Sometimes a small dog can lead a broken man back to the one place his heart fears most. In Dry Hollow, Miss Lucinda Bell screamed at mountain man Elias Boone to take his dog and leave town. The crowd expected a fight. Instead, Elias spoke quietly. "This pup belonged to your brother, Lucinda. Found him by a grave marked J. Bell." Her face went white. The mountain man had been carrying her family's painful truth for years. What secret had he been protecting, and why had he finally come back to face it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dry Hollow's weathered boardwalk, painting the town in shades of gold and amber that reminded folks of better times. This was a place where memories lived longer than the people who made them, where every creaking board and faded storefront held stories that grandchildren would tell their own grandchildren someday. Elias Boone had been walking these same wooden planks for the better part of an hour, the small brown and white pup tucked securely in his worn leather coat. The dog's name was Rusty, though he'd answered to Jake for the first 3 years of his life. Names, Elias had learned, were sometimes the first casualties of grief. The mountain man's boots made a steady rhythm against the wood, each step deliberate and measured. At 62, Elias moved with the careful grace of someone who'd learned that life could change direction in a heartbeat. His beard, more silver than brown now, caught the morning light as he paused outside Murphy's general store. Through the dusty window, he could see old Tom Murphy arranging tins of peaches on a shelf. The same shelf where Elias had bought penny candy as a boy, some 50 years back. Those were simpler times, when the biggest worry in Dry Hollow was whether Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning apple pie would take first place at the county fair again. Elias remembered running barefoot down these very streets with Jacob Bell, both of them full of dreams about exploring the mountains that surrounded their little valley like protective arms. Jacob Bell, even thinking the name, brought a familiar ache to Elias's chest. The pup stirred in his coat, brown eyes looking up with the kind of trust that only dogs possessed. Rusty had been Jacob's constant companion for those final years, the one witness to a man's slow surrender to demons that had followed him home from a war that ended decades ago, but never truly finished. "Easy there, boy," Elias murmured, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd spent years talking to creatures that couldn't talk back, but understood everything nonetheless. "We're almost there." Dry Hollow hadn't changed much in the 15 years since Elias had last walked these streets. The same faded green paint peeled from the barbershop's siding. The same hand-painted sign swayed in front of Mabel's cafe, promising best coffee this side of heaven in letters that had grown dim but never lost their optimism. Even the same stray cat, or perhaps its great-granddaughter, sunned itself on the steps of the old courthouse. But change had come to the people. Elias could see it in the way conversations stopped when he passed, in the sideways glances and hushed whispers that followed his footsteps. He'd become something of a legend in these parts, the man who'd walked away from everything civilized to live alone in the high country. Some said he'd gone wild. Others whispered about tragedy that drove him to solitude. The truth, as it often was, lay somewhere in between. The sound of children's laughter drew his attention to the schoolyard across the street, where a dozen youngsters chased each other in the eternal game of tag that every generation discovered anew. Their teacher, a young woman with kind eyes and infinite patience, watched from the shade of an old oak tree. Elias remembered when that tree was barely taller than he was, when he and Jacob had carved their initials in its smooth bark and sworn they'd be friends forever. Forever had turned out to be shorter than either boy had imagined. As he walked past the schoolyard, one of the children, a freckled-faced boy with grass stains on his knees, stopped running and stared. There was something in that innocent gaze that reminded Elias of himself at that age, full of curiosity about the wider world and the mysteries it held. "Morning, mister," the boy called out. showing the natural friendliness that small towns either nurtured or beaten out of their children, depending on their luck. "Morning to you too." "Son," Elias replied, tipping his weathered hat. The gesture felt natural, a remnant of manners learned from parents who believed courtesy was the foundation of civilization. The boy's teacher noticed the exchange and took a step forward, her protective instincts clearly warring with politeness. Elias understood. In her eyes he was a stranger with a dog, appearing in their peaceful town without warning or explanation. A good teacher learned to trust her instincts about such things. He touched his hat brim again, this time in her direction, and continued on his way. There would be time for proper introductions later, after he'd done what he came to do. The weight of the small wooden box in his coat pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step. It contained everything that remained of a friendship that had defined two boys' lives and ultimately destroyed one man's peace. Inside that box lay a purple heart that Jacob had thrown in the river in a moment of anguish, only to fish it out again 3 days later. Waterlogged and tarnished, but somehow more precious for its imperfection. There were other items too, a photograph of two grinning soldiers with their arms around each other's shoulders. Taken the day before, everything went wrong. A letter from Jacob's mother that had arrived 2 weeks after he'd already shipped overseas. A silver compass that had guided him through jungles where civilized men learned to do uncivilized things. Elias had carried these memories in his pocket and in his heart for 15 years, waiting for the right time to bring them home. The right time, as it turned out, was when he could no longer carry them alone. The main street of Dry Hollow led inevitably to its heart. A small town square centered around a weathered stone monument, honoring the local boys who'd never come home from various wars. Fresh flowers lay at its base, placed there by hands that remembered and hearts that refused to let their sacrifice fade into history's shadows. Jacob Bell's name was carved into that stone. Third line from the top, letters deep enough to last long after everyone who knew him personally had joined him in whatever came after. But Elias knew that Jacob hadn't died in Vietnam, despite what the official records claimed. He'd made it home, at least in body. His spirit, the part of him that used to laugh at nothing and dream about everything, had stayed behind in a jungle clearing, where good intentions met harsh reality, and neither side walked away unchanged. The morning crowd was beginning to gather now, drawn by the magnetic pull of routine and the comfort of familiar faces. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the post office, her white hair perfectly pinned despite the early hour. She nodded politely to Elias, though her eyes held questions she was too proper to voice directly. Behind her came Bill Hoffman, the town's unofficial mayor and official warrior. A man who'd spent 40 years trying to attract new business to Dry Hollow, while simultaneously fearing what change might bring. His eyes lingered on Elias with the particular intensity of someone trying to place a half-remembered face. "Excuse me," Bill said, his voice carrying the careful diplomacy of a man accustomed to handling delicate situations. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Bill Hoffman, and I help coordinate things here in Dry Hollow." Elias stopped walking and turned to face the man fully. There was something to be said for directness, even when it made things more complicated. "Elias Boone," he replied, extending his hand in the time-honored gesture of civilized greeting. "I used to live here long time back." Recognition flickered in Bill's eyes, followed quickly by uncertainty. The name was familiar, but the context remained elusive, like trying to remember a song when you could only recall the melody. "Boone," Bill repeated thoughtfully. "That name rings a bell. Your family had the place up near Cedar Creek, didn't they?" "My grandfather did. Built a cabin there in '08, raised my father there. My father raised me there until I was old enough for school." The words came easier than Elias had expected. Memory, it seemed, was like muscle. Even after years of disuse, it remembered how to function when called upon. "I remember now," Bill said, his face brightening with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. "You and Jacob Bell were thick as thieves back in the day, always getting into some kind of mischief together." The mention of Jacob's name hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire, visible and substantial but impossible to grasp directly. Elias felt the pup stir against his chest, as if the dog somehow understood that they were getting close to the heart of things. "Jacob was a good friend," Elias said simply. "The best kind of friend. Terrible shame what happened to him over there," Bill continued, his voice taking on the particular reverence people reserved for discussing the honored dead. "Town's never been quite the same without him. He had a way of bringing people together, you know. Always organizing something, a fishing tournament, a barn raising, a community picnic. Made everyone feel like they belonged to something bigger than themselves." Elias nodded, though he knew that Bill's memories, while genuine, captured only part of the truth. Jacob had indeed been a natural leader, someone others instinctively followed and trusted. But he'd also been haunted by a restless energy that civilian life could never quite contain. A need to prove himself that had ultimately led him to a jungle on the other side of the world, where proving yourself meant surviving another day. His sister still lives here. "You know," Bill added almost as an afterthought, "Lucinda Bell, never married, dedicated her whole life to keeping his memory alive. She runs the library now, has for 20 years. Does a fine job of it too." The pup whimpered softly, and Elias realized his grip had tightened unconsciously. Lucinda Bell, the little girl who used to follow Jacob and him around, desperate to be included in their adventures, but too young to keep up with boys who thought themselves men. She would be the hardest part of this journey. The one person in Dry Hollow who had the most right to be angry about the secrets he'd kept. But she also had the most right to know the truth, even if that truth was more complicated than the clean narrative carved into the war memorial. "I expect I'll see her before I leave," Elias said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Bill smiled, the expression of a man pleased to have facilitated a reunion between old friends. If only he knew how complex that reunion was likely to be. "Well, I should let you get on with your business," Bill said, tipping his hat with small-town courtesy. "But before you head out of town again, stop by the hardware store. I'd love to hear some stories about the old days. This town could use a few more good stories." As Bill walked away, Elias stood quietly in the morning sunshine, feeling the weight of 15 years pressing down on his shoulders like a pack loaded for a long journey through difficult country. The pup licked his hand through the opening in his coat, a gentle reminder that some burdens were shared willingly, even by those who couldn't understand their full significance. Around him, Dry Hollow continued its peaceful morning routine, unaware that the day would end very differently from how it had begun. Change was coming to their quiet town, carried in the heart of a mountain man and the memories of a dog who had loved two masters and lost them both to different kinds of wars. The church bell chimed 9 o'clock, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a prayer made audible. Elias took a deep breath, adjusted his coat around the pup, and began walking toward the library where Lucinda Bell had spent 20 years tending to other people's stories while protecting the most important story of all, the truth about her brother's final years and the friend who had promised to bring him home. The Dry Hollow Public Library occupied a brick building that had served as the town's schoolhouse until 1963, when a larger facility was built on the other side of the railroad tracks. Its tall windows still caught the morning light the way they had when Jacob Bell had sat at a desk near the back, more interested in watching the mountains than conjugating verbs. Elias paused at the bottom of the stone steps, his weathered hand resting on the iron railing that countless children had slid down during recess breaks that existed now only in memory. The brass plaque beside the heavy oak door read Lucinda M. Bell, head librarian, the letters crisp and professional, giving no hint of the little girl who had once begged to tag along on adventures she was too small to share. The pup sensed his hesitation and whimpered softly, brown eyes looking up with the patient concern that dogs reserved for their humans in moments of distress. Elias scratched behind the animal's ears, taking comfort in the simple warmth of a living creature who asked nothing more complicated than companionship and the occasional bit of jerky. "I know, boy," he murmured. "This part's going to be hard." Through the tall windows, he could see movement inside, someone shelving books with the methodical precision of a person who found peace in order. The sight stirred something deep in his chest, a recognition that went beyond the physical act to the character it revealed. Lucinda had always been that way, even as a child. While Jacob scattered his energy like seeds in the wind, his sister gathered and organized, creating small pockets of harmony in a world that often seemed determined to embrace chaos. The library door opened with the same gentle chime it had used to announce visitors for 40 years. Inside, the smell of aging paper and binding glue mingled with the faint scent of the lavender sachets that Lucinda's mother had taught her to make before cancer claimed her voice and then her life. The high ceilings amplified even the softest sounds, the whisper of turning pages, the careful placement of books on shelves, the quiet breathing of people lost in worlds made of words. Lucinda Bell stood with her back to the door, reaching for a high shelf with the practiced efficiency of someone who had arranged these same books countless times. At 55, she moved with the careful grace of a woman who had learned to find contentment in routine, though something in her posture suggested that contentment had been earned rather than given. Her hair, once the same sandy brown as her brother's, had gone silver around the temples and been pinned back in the practical style of someone who valued function over fashion. She wore a blue cardigan that had seen better years but fit her like an old friend, and sensible shoes that whispered rather than clicked against the hardwood floors. "I'll be with you in just a moment," she said without turning around, her voice carrying the patient warmth that librarians cultivated like gardeners tended roses. "If you're looking for anything in particular, the card catalogue is on the center table. Though I can probably point you in the right direction if you tell me what you need." Elias stood quietly in the doorway, the pup now fully awake and alert in his arms. 15 years was a long time to practice what you were going to say to someone, but now that the moment had arrived, all his carefully rehearsed words seemed inadequate for the weight of what needed to be said. "I'm looking for someone who might remember a boy named Jacob Bell," he said finally, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. The effect was immediate and profound. Lucinda's entire body went still, her hand frozen halfway to a book spine. For a long moment, the only sound in the library was the ticking of the grandfather clock that had once kept time for eager children waiting for the school bell to release them to their adventures. When she finally turned around, her face had gone pale, but her eyes held the fierce protectiveness that Elias remembered from their childhood. The look she'd worn whenever older children had tried to tease Jacob about his stutter, or when their father had come home from the mine with whiskey on his breath and anger in his fists. "Jacob Bell was my brother," she said, each word carefully measured. "He died in Vietnam in 1969. If you're some kind of reporter looking for a story, or a government man with more forms to fill out, you can turn around and walk right back out that door." The pup chose that moment to poke his head out of Elias's coat. Brown ears perked forward with curiosity about this new person whose voice carried such interesting tensions. The sight of the dog seemed to catch Lucinda off guard, her expression shifting from defensive to confused. "I'm not a reporter," Elias said gently, "and I'm not from the government. My name is Elias Boone. I was Jacob's friend." Recognition flickered in her eyes like a match struck in darkness. He could see her mind working, placing his face in the context of memories that had been carefully preserved but rarely examined too closely, like photographs kept in a drawer to prevent them from fading in the light. "Elias Boone," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "My God, I haven't seen you since—" She stopped, her hand going to her throat, as if the words were stuck there and needed help finding their way out. "Since the day I left for the mountains," he finished for her. The day after Jacob's funeral, the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions and carefully guarded pain. Lucinda's eyes moved between his face and the dog in his arms, searching for connections that her logical mind told her couldn't exist, but her heart suggested might be possible. "That's not possible," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "Jacob died in Vietnam. We had a funeral. We buried him in the cemetery on Cemetery Hill, right next to our parents. I visit his grave every Sunday after church. I put flowers there, fresh ones, every week for 24 years. Elias felt something break inside his chest. A careful wall that he'd built to contain the truth, finally cracking under the weight of her devotion. He'd known she would have mourned, but he hadn't fully grasped the depths of her loyalty to a brother she'd lost too young, or the way that loyalty had shaped every day of her life since. "Lucinda," he said, his voice as gentle as he could make it, "there are some things about Jacob's last years that you don't know. Things I should have told you a long time ago, but couldn't. Things I'm not sure I can tell you even now, but have to try." The pup squirmed in his arms, sensing the tension that filled the space between them like smoke. Lucinda's eyes focused on the animal with laser intensity, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces didn't quite fit together. "Why did you bring a dog to my library?" she asked, though her tone suggested that she suspected the answer might be more significant than the question implied. Elias took a deep breath, knowing that the next words would change everything between them forever. Once spoken, they could never be taken back, and the comfortable fiction that had allowed both of them to survive the last 15 years would be destroyed as completely as if he'd taken a hammer to Jacob's headstone. "Because this dog belonged to your brother," he said. "His name was Jake, same as Jacob, though I've been calling him Rusty for the past 3 months. I found him sitting beside a grave marker that I carved myself, up in the high country where Jacob lived for the 6 years after he was supposed to have died in that helicopter crash." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning a canyon, impossible to cross safely, but also impossible to ignore. Lucinda's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical in any other context: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally a kind of desperate hope that she tried to push down before it could take root and grow into something that might destroy her. "That's not true," she whispered. But her eyes had locked onto the dog's face with an intensity that suggested her heart was already recognizing something her mind refused to accept. "You're lying. Jacob died in Vietnam. The army told us. We got a telegram. We had a funeral. The army told you what they believed to be true," Elias said carefully, "and what I let them believe. But Jacob survived that crash, Lucinda. He survived it, and he lived in the mountains for 6 more years, trying to find a way to come home to you." The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, its bronze voice echoing in the sudden silence. Outside, the sounds of Dry Hollow's peaceful morning continued. Children playing, cars passing, the eternal rhythm of small-town life. But inside the library, 2 people faced a truth that would reshape everything they thought they knew about love, loss, and the complicated mathematics of grief. Lucinda Bell sank into the chair behind her desk, her practical cardigan suddenly looking too large for her frame. In the space of 5 minutes, the careful life she had built around her brother's memory had been shaken to its foundation. Now she had to decide whether to let it crumble completely, or to find the courage to build something new on the ruins of what she thought she knew. The silence in the library stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Lucinda sat behind her desk, her hands folded so tightly that the knuckles had gone white, while Elias remained standing near the door with the dog still cradled in his arms. Between them lay the wreckage of a carefully constructed truth that had sustained one woman's life for over 2 decades. "Show me," Lucinda said finally, her voice barely audible above the grandfather clock's steady ticking. "Show me proof." Elias had expected this moment, had prepared for it during the long walk down from the mountains. From his coat pocket, he withdrew the small wooden box that had traveled with him through 15 years of solitude. The box itself was unremarkable. carved from pine by hands that had learned to find comfort in simple, repetitive tasks, but its contents represented the difference between the story Dry Hollow believed and the truth that only two people had known. He placed the box on Lucinda's desk with the reverence of someone handling sacred relics. The wood had been worn smooth by countless handlings, and a simple JB was carved into the lid in letters that matched the marking on the grave he'd shown to no living soul. "Before you open it," Elias said gently, "you need to understand that Jacob made me promise never to tell you he'd survived. He was sick, Lucinda, not just in his body, though that was part of it. In his mind, his spirit. The war had taken something from him that he never found a way to get back." Lucinda's fingers hovered over the box like a pianist preparing to play a piece she'd never learned, but somehow knew by heart. "What kind of sick?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications that both understood but neither wanted to voice directly. Elias had spent 6 years watching Jacob wrestle with demons that had no names in polite conversation, had seen his friend disappear for days at a time, only to return hollow-eyed and shaking, had held him during nightmares that dragged him back to jungles where the rules of civilization held no meaning. The kind of sick that comes from doing things no man should have to do, then having to live with the memory afterward, Elias said. The kind that makes a person feel like they've died inside, even when their body keeps on breathing. Lucinda opened the box with trembling fingers, and the morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated its contents like artifacts in a museum display. The purple heart lay on top, its ribbon faded, but the metal still catching light with the dignity that medals retained, even when their recipients could no longer bear their weight. Beneath it, the photograph of 2 young soldiers smiled up at them, with the kind of innocent confidence that belonged to an age when the world seemed larger but also more comprehensible. This was taken the day before the operation that was supposed to kill him, Elias said, pointing to the photograph. Jacob kept it in his pocket through everything that came after. Said it reminded him of who he used to be before he learned things he wished he could forget. Lucinda lifted the photograph with hands that shook like autumn leaves in a strong wind. Her finger traced the outline of her brother's face, younger than she remembered him, but undeniably Jacob, with his lopsided grin and eyes that held all the mischief of their shared childhood. "He looks so young," she whispered, and Elias could hear 17 years of grief condensing into those 4 words. "We both were. Too young for what they asked us to do, but old enough to know we had to do it anyway." He paused, watching her examine each item in the box with the careful attention of someone trying to reconcile memory with evidence. "Jacob saved my life 3 times in Vietnam, once from enemy fire, once from my own stupidity, and once from despair so deep I couldn't see a way out of it." The silver compass gleamed dully in the morning light, its needle still pointing true north after all these years. Lucinda held it up to the window, watching the needle swing gently back and forth before settling into position. "He always carried this," she said, and it wasn't a question. Even as a boy, he never went into the woods without it. Said a man could get lost easier than he could get found, so it was better to always know which way was home. That compass brought us both back from places where we should have died, Elias confirmed. Jacob used to say it wasn't just pointing north, it was pointing toward everything worth coming home to. Toward you, toward Dry Hollow, toward the life he'd left behind. The pup stirred in his arms, lifting his head to look at Lucinda with the kind of gentle curiosity that dogs brought to all new situations. There was something in the animal's expression, a tilt of the head and a particular alertness in the brown eyes, that made Lucinda catch her breath. "He does that exact same thing Jacob used to do," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "That head tilt, that look, like he's listening to something the rest of us can't quite hear. Dogs pick up habits from their people," Elias said. "Jake lived with your brother for 3 years before Jacob passed. Learned his ways, his mannerisms, even his moods. Sometimes I think Jake understood Jacob better than Jacob understood himself." Lucinda reached across the desk hesitantly, her fingers extended toward the dog's muzzle. Jake sniffed her hand with the careful politeness that well-mannered dogs used when meeting new humans, then gently licked her fingertips with a pink tongue that was warm and soft and utterly alive. The simple contact broke something loose in Lucinda's chest, and she began to cry. Not the loud, dramatic tears of grief observed, but the quiet, steady weeping of someone finally allowing themselves to feel emotions they'd kept locked away, for fear they might prove too powerful to survive. "Why didn't he come home?" she asked through her tears. "Why didn't he come to me? I would have taken care of him. I would have helped him heal, whatever it took." Elias felt his own eyes burning with unshed moisture. This was the question he dreaded most, because it cut straight to the heart of Jacob's final tragedy. Not that he'd been too wounded to heal, but that he'd believed himself too damaged to deserve healing, because he loved you too much to let you see what the war had made of him, Elias said. Because he thought you deserved to remember the brother who left, not the man who came back. Because he was afraid that if you saw him as he really was, broken, haunted, sometimes violent in his sleep, you'd stop loving the boy he used to be. The grandfather clock chimed 10 o'clock, marking the passage of time that felt both glacially slow and impossibly swift. Outside the library windows, Dry Hollow continued its peaceful morning routine, unaware that inside the converted schoolhouse, two people were reconstructing the foundation of everything they'd believed about love, sacrifice, and the terrible mathematics of survival. Jake had settled into Lucinda's gentle stroking, his eyes half closed in the contentment that dogs found so easily and humans search for so desperately. In that simple moment of connection between a grieving sister and her brother's faithful companion, 15 years of carefully guarded secrets began their slow transformation into something that might eventually resemble healing. But first, there were more truths to be told, more wounds to be opened before they could properly close, and more questions that demanded answers even when those answers threatened to destroy the very foundations of everything two people had built their lives upon. Lucinda wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the kind of practical gesture that spoke to a lifetime of dealing with difficulties without making a fuss about them. She picked up the letter from the wooden box, the one from their mother that had arrived 2 weeks too late, and held it without opening it, as if she could absorb its contents through her fingertips. "I wrote this," she said softly. "Mama was too sick by then to hold a pen steady, so she dictated it to me, told me exactly what to say, how to say it. She made me read it back 3 times to make sure I'd gotten every word right." Elias nodded, remembering how Jacob had clutched that letter during his worst nights, when the demons were particularly active and sleep offered no refuge from memories that played on endless repeat. Sometimes Jacob would read it aloud in the darkness of their mountain cabin, his voice breaking on words that had been meant to comfort but had arrived too late to serve their intended purpose. "What did she say?" Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew. He'd heard Jacob recite portions of it during those long, difficult nights when talking was the only thing standing between his friend and complete surrender to the darkness that lived inside him, that she was proud of him, that she understood why he'd felt called to serve his country, even though it meant leaving everyone who loved him behind, that she'd be waiting for him when he came home, no matter how long that took or what condition he was in when he got there. Lucinda's voice caught on the last words, and she pressed the letter against her chest, as if she could somehow transfer its love directly to her heart. "She was a good woman, your mother," Elias said. "Jacob talked about her every day, about how she used to make molasses cookies that were somehow crispy on the outside but soft in the middle, and how she never missed a single one of his school plays, even when he was just a tree or a rock with no lines to speak." A smile flickered across Lucinda's face, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She kept every program from those plays in a shoebox under her bed. Even after she got sick, she'd take them out sometimes and read them aloud, remembering which parts he'd played and how nervous he'd been beforehand. The pup Jake had settled into a comfortable position across Lucinda's lap, accepting her gentle stroking with the gracious dignity that dogs brought to moments of human tenderness. There was something deeply peaceful about the scene, as if the animal's presence had created a small island of calm in the emotional storm that surrounded them. "Tell me about those 6 years," Lucinda said, her voice steadier now, but still fragile around the edges. "Tell me what his life was like. Tell me if he was happy, even sometimes." Elias pulled up a chair from one of the library tables, the wooden legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor. This was the part of the story that he'd rehearsed least, because it required him to find words for experiences that had existed, mostly in silence, two damaged men learning to live with their wounds in a place where the only witnesses were mountains and sky. "He built a good cabin," Elias began, choosing his words carefully. "Took him most of the first year working with hand tools and timber he cut himself. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and warm, and it had windows facing east so he could watch the sun come up every morning. He said the sunrise reminded him that every day was a chance to start over." Lucinda leaned forward slightly, hungry for details that could help her construct a picture of her brother's hidden life. What did he do with his time? How did he keep himself occupied? "He read a lot. I'd bring him books whenever I went to town for supplies, history mostly, and biographies of men who'd faced difficult circumstances and found ways to keep going. He had a particular fondness for Lewis and Clark, said there was something comforting about reading stories of people who'd gotten lost in the wilderness and still managed to find their way home." The grandfather clock's steady ticking filled a comfortable pause, while both of them absorbed the significance of Jacob's literary preferences. Outside, a cardinal landed on the windowsill and peered through the glass with bright, curious eyes before flying away to attend to whatever urgent business occupied cardinals on peaceful autumn mornings. "He carved, too," Elias continued. "Started with simple things, wooden spoons, bowls, a chess set that took him 3 months to finish. But eventually he moved on to more elaborate pieces, animals mostly. He had a gift for capturing the essence of a creature in wood, the way it moved and held itself, the personality that showed in its eyes." Lucinda's hand stilled on Jake's fur. "He always did have clever hands. Even as a boy, he could fix anything that was broken, build anything that was needed. Papa used to say Jacob could make something useful out of nothing more than good intentions and elbow grease." "The cabin is full of his work," Elias said. "Shelves lined with wooden animals that look so lifelike you expect them to start breathing. He made a whole family of bears once, Papa Bear, Mama Bear, Baby Bear, and arranged them like they were having a conversation around a tiny wooden table." The image brought fresh tears to Lucinda's eyes. But these were different from her earlier weeping. These tears carried recognition along with grief, the bittersweet joy of discovering that the brother she'd mourned had found ways to keep the best parts of himself alive, even in exile. "Did he ever mention me?" she asked, and Elias could hear the little sister in her voice, the child who had always wondered if she mattered as much to Jacob as he mattered to her. "Every single day," Elias replied without hesitation. He kept a calendar, and every Sunday he'd mark it with a little heart and say, "Lucy's putting flowers on my grave today." He knew your routine, knew how devoted you were to his memory. Sometimes he'd spend the whole day carving, and when I'd ask what he was making, he'd say, "Something beautiful for Lucy, for when she's ready to know the truth." Jake lifted his head at the sound of Lucinda's sharp intake of breath, brown eyes alert with the kind of canine concern that never failed to humble humans with its simple purity. The dog seemed to sense that something significant was happening, that the woman stroking his fur was discovering pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known was missing. "There are things he made for you," Elias said quietly. "A whole collection of them stored in a special box in his cabin. I think he always hoped that someday he'd find the courage to come down from the mountain and give them to you himself. When that day never came, he made me promise to make sure you got them eventually." Lucinda buried her face in Jake's soft fur. her shoulders shaking with the effort of containing emotions that had grown too large for any single heart to hold. 24 years of grief was transforming into something more complex, sorrow mixed with wonder, loss balanced by unexpected discovery, and underneath it all, the dawning realization that love could survive even the most impossible circumstances if it was tended carefully enough. The library door chimed softly as someone entered, and both Elias and Lucinda looked up to see Mrs. Patterson from the post office, her arms full of mail and her expression curious about the unusual scene before her. She took in the sight of Lucinda crying while holding a strange dog, with an unfamiliar mountain man sitting beside her desk, and her eyebrows rose in the particular way that small-town women perfected when encountering situations that didn't fit neatly into expected categories. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Mrs. Patterson said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sorry and was rather hoping for an explanation that would satisfy her obvious curiosity. "I have the weekly delivery for the library, but I can come back later if this isn't a good time." Lucinda straightened in her chair, automatically shifting into the professional mode that 20 years of public service had made second nature. She wiped her eyes with a tissue from her desk drawer and managed a smile that was wobbly around the edges, but recognizably genuine. "It's fine, Eleanor. Just some unexpected news about my family." She gestured toward Elias with the careful politeness that librarians use to introduce patrons who might or might not be entirely welcome. "This is Elias Boone. He was a friend of Jacob's." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted immediately, the curiosity transforming into the particular mixture of sympathy and interest that mention of Jacob Bell's name always produced in Dry Hollow. The town had claimed him as their golden boy, their tragic hero, and any connection to his memory was automatically elevated to something approaching sacred. "Elias Boone," she repeated, her voice taking on the tone people used when trying to place a half-remembered name. "I thought that name sounded familiar when Bill Hoffman mentioned it this morning. You're the boy who used to run wild in the mountains with Jacob, aren't you? The one whose grandfather built that cabin up near Cedar Creek." "Yes, ma'am," Elias replied, standing respectfully as his grandfather had taught him to do when addressing his elders. "That's me, Mrs. Patterson." Set the mail bundle on Lucinda's desk with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades handling other people's correspondence and understood its importance to their daily lives. Her eyes lingered on Jake, who had settled comfortably in Lucinda's lap and showed no inclination to move. "What a lovely dog," she said, though there was a question in her voice that suggested she was wondering about the animal's sudden appearance in a place where pets were not typically welcome. "He belonged to Jacob," Lucinda said simply, and the words hung in the air like a statement that everyone understood was significant, but nobody quite knew how to interpret. Mrs. Patterson's face went through a series of expressions that would have been amusing under different circumstances: confusion, calculation, and finally the kind of polite acceptance that well-mannered people employed when they encountered information that didn't immediately make sense, but seemed to matter deeply to someone they cared about. "I see," she said, though clearly she didn't see at all. "Well, he's certainly well behaved. Not all dogs have such good library manners." After Mrs. Patterson left, carrying with her the kind of intriguing partial information that would fuel coffee shop conversations for days to come, the library settled back into its peaceful quiet. But the interruption had reminded both Elias and Lucinda that they existed in a community where privacy was a luxury that few people could afford for long. "People are going to talk," Lucinda said, stating the obvious with the resignation of someone who had lived her entire life in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Or thought they did. Let them talk," Elias replied. "The truth has been buried long enough. Maybe it's time for folks to know that heroes don't always come home in the ways we expect them to." Lucinda's fingers found the compass in the wooden box, turning it over in her palm while she thought. The metal was warm from the sunlight streaming through the windows. and the inscription on the back, "To JB from LB." Christmas 1962 was still clearly visible despite the years of handling. "I gave him this for his 16th birthday," she said. "Saved up for 3 months to buy it from Henderson's Hardware. Mr. Henderson said it was the finest compass he'd ever ordered. Guaranteed to work even in the worst conditions." "It never failed him," Elias confirmed. "Even when everything else went wrong, that compass kept pointing true. Jacob used to say it was like carrying a piece of your love with him wherever he went." The admission brought fresh tears to Lucinda's eyes, but she brushed them away with the back of her hand. There was something different about her crying now, less desperate, more cleansing, as if each tear was washing away a layer of grief that had accumulated over the years, like dust on a mirror. "I need to see where he lived," she said suddenly, her voice carrying a determination that hadn't been there before. "I need to see this cabin you've told me about, see the things he made, understand what his life was really like during those 6 years." Elias had expected this request, had known it would come eventually, but that didn't make it any easier to contemplate. The cabin held memories that were both beautiful and terrible, evidence of Jacob's struggles as well as his moments of peace. Taking Lucinda there would mean exposing her to the full complexity of her brother's hidden life, including the parts that might be more difficult to accept than the romantic image of a wounded hero finding solace in the wilderness. "It's not an easy journey," he said carefully. 3 hours on horseback through country that doesn't forgive mistakes. And when we get there, what you'll find might not match what you're hoping to see. "I don't care about easy," Lucinda replied, her chin lifting with the stubborn determination that had carried her through 24 years of tending to other people's stories while protecting her own carefully guarded grief. "I need to understand. I need to see where my brother spent his last years, touch the things he touched, breathe the same air he breathed." Jake lifted his head from his comfortable position and looked directly at Elias, brown eyes serious and alert. There was something almost human in that gaze, a kind of understanding that transcended the usual boundaries between species. The dog seemed to be saying that some journeys were necessary regardless of their difficulty, that some truths required witness regardless of their cost. "All right," Elias said finally, "but we'll need to make preparations. The cabin's been empty for 3 months, and mountain weather can change without warning. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." Lucinda nodded, already mentally cataloguing the things she would need to arrange. Someone to cover her duties at the library, practical clothing for mountain travel, a way to explain her sudden absence without revealing more than she was ready to share with the rest of Dry Hollow. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning, if you can manage it. The weather's supposed to hold for another few days, and after that, winter starts making its presence known in the high country." Outside the library windows, the cardinal returned to perch on the sill, its red feathers bright against the autumn sky. It cocked its head and peered through the glass, with the kind of intense curiosity that birds brought to human activities they couldn't quite understand, but found endlessly fascinating. For a moment, all 3 of them, Elias, Lucinda, and Jake, watched the bird with the shared appreciation that humans and dogs often discovered for the simple beauty of wild creatures going about their daily business. Then the cardinal flew away, and they returned to the complex business of planning a journey that would take them not just into the mountains, but into the heart of a story that had been waiting 24 years for its proper ending. That evening, Lucinda sat in her small kitchen, staring at the telephone, while Jake dozed contentedly at her feet on a borrowed blanket from the library's reading corner. The dog had taken to her with the easy acceptance that animals showed when they recognized kindness, though there were moments when his brown eyes seemed to hold memories of someone else entirely. She needed to call her assistant, Margaret, to arrange coverage for the library, but the conversation would require explanations she wasn't ready to give. How do you tell someone that the brother you've mourned for 24 years had actually lived for 6 additional years without your knowledge? How do you explain that you're about to trek into the mountains with a man you barely remember from childhood, following the ghost of a dog who might hold the key to understanding a grief you thought you'd learned to carry? The kitchen around her reflected the careful simplicity of a woman who had built her life around routine and modest pleasures. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, lavender, rosemary, thyme, filling the air with the gentle fragrance of a garden that had provided both sustenance and solace through decades of solitary dinners. The photographs on her refrigerator showed library events, community gatherings, the quiet celebrations of a life lived in service to others while keeping her deepest sorrows private. But now, spread across her kitchen table, lay the contents of Jacob's wooden box alongside a topographical map that Elias had left with her. The map showed the route they would take to reach the cabin, a winding path through terrain that looked forbidding even on paper. Steep ridges, narrow valleys, areas marked with symbols that indicated places where the unwary could lose their way permanently. She picked up the photograph of Jacob and Elias in their army uniforms, studying their faces with the intensity of someone trying to decode a message written in a language she'd never learned to read. They looked so young, she thought, though she knew Jacob had been 23 when the picture was taken, older than she was now when she'd stood beside his grave and promised to keep his memory alive forever. The telephone rang, startling both her and Jake from their respective contemplations. The dog lifted his head with alert ears while Lucinda reached for the receiver with hands that trembled, slightly from nerves and the residual shock of a day that had turned her. Carefully ordered world upside down. Hello? Lucy, it's Margaret. I hope I'm not calling too late, but Eleanor Patterson stopped by my house this afternoon with the most interesting story about a strange man and a dog in the library today. She seemed to think it was connected to Jacob somehow. Lucinda closed her eyes, recognizing the gentle curiosity in her assistant's voice. Margaret Chen had moved to Dry Hollow 5 years ago to care for her aging mother, and had found in the library the kind of peaceful refuge that suited her quiet nature. She was the closest thing Lucinda had to a genuine friend, someone who understood the particular loneliness of women who had dedicated their lives to caring for others while keeping their own needs carefully contained. It's complicated, Margaret, Lucinda said finally. More complicated than I can explain over the phone. But I need to ask a favor. Can you handle the library on your own for the next couple of days? I have some family business that needs my attention. Of course, Margaret replied without hesitation, though Lucinda could hear the concern in her voice. Are you all right? You sound different somehow. The question hung in the air, while Lucinda struggled to find words for feeling she barely understood herself. Was she all right? Her brother, whom she'd believed dead for 24 years, had actually lived until 3 months ago. The grief she'd carried like a sacred burden had been based on incomplete information. The ritual of weekly flowers on his grave had been a kind of performance, meaningful to her but irrelevant to his actual experience. I'm not sure, she answered honestly, but I think I might be eventually. After hanging up, Lucinda walked to the window that faced west toward the mountains. The peaks were invisible in the darkness, but she could feel their presence like a weight pressing against the horizon. Somewhere up there, in a cabin she'd never seen, lay the remnants of a life she'd never known her brother had lived. Tomorrow, she would begin the journey toward understanding not just how Jacob had died, but how he had chosen to live after the world believed him dead. Jake padded over to join her at the window, his warm presence against her leg both comforting and strange. She'd never been particularly fond of dogs. They required attention and care that her ordered life hadn't had room for. But this animal felt different somehow. There was an intelligence in his brown eyes that suggested he understood more about human sorrow than most humans did. What was he like in those last years? She asked the dog quietly, knowing that the question was foolish, but needing to voice it anyway. Was he happy? Did he find any peace up there in the mountains? Jake looked up at her, with the patient attention that dogs gave to human speech they couldn't understand but recognized as important. His tail wagged slowly, a gesture that seemed less about excitement than about offering comfort to someone who clearly needed it. From her bedroom dresser, Lucinda retrieved the small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to her mother. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, lay the only other photograph she had of Jacob, a school picture taken during his senior year, before Vietnam had become more than a place name in the newspaper. His smile in that photograph was uncomplicated, full of the confidence that belonged to young men who believed the world held nothing they couldn't handle with good intentions and hard work. She placed the school photograph next to the military picture on her kitchen table, creating a small shrine to the brother she thought she'd known completely. The contrast between the two images was stark: innocence and experience, hope and knowledge. The boy who had left Dry Hollow and the man who had learned things that couldn't be unlearned. But now there would be other photographs, or at least the stories that could create pictures in her mind. Images of Jacob building a cabin with his own hands, carving wooden animals by lamplight, watching sunrises that reminded him every morning that survival was a choice worth making again and again. The grandfather clock in her living room chimed 11, its bronze voice carrying through the small house with the same steady rhythm that had marked time in the library for decades. Soon she would need to try to sleep, to rest before tomorrow's journey into country that would be as foreign to her as the revelation that her understanding of her brother's life had been built on incomplete truths. But first, she sat quietly with Jake at her feet, listening to the gentle sounds of a house settling into nighttime quiet, and tried to prepare her heart for discoveries that might be too large for any single person to carry alone. Tomorrow, she would learn what it meant to love someone whose story was more complicated than the version she'd been telling herself for 24 years. Dawn came early in the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold that reminded Lucinda of the watercolors Jacob used to paint during their childhood summers. She had arrived at the livery stable before sunrise, carrying a backpack that felt heavier than its contents should warrant. Weighed down by anticipation and the growing certainty that the day would fundamentally change her understanding of everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and the complicated geography of family loyalty. Elias was already there, saddling 2 horses with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent more years conversing with animals than with humans. The horses were sturdy mountain breeds, chosen for endurance rather than elegance, their coats thick, with the kind of winter preparation that spoke to the wisdom of creatures who understood that survival often depended on being ready for conditions that hadn't yet arrived. Jake sat nearby, alert and eager, his tail wagging with the excitement of a dog who recognized the preparations for an adventure. He wore a small pack of his own, designed to carry water and basic supplies, and seemed to understand his role in the expedition with the kind of intuitive intelligence that never failed to humble humans with its simple clarity. "The trail starts easy," Elias said, helping Lucinda adjust her stirrups with the patient care of someone who knew that small discomforts could become major problems during a long day's ride. "But it gets more challenging as we climb. The last 2 miles to the cabin are steep enough that we'll need to dismount and lead the horses." Lucinda nodded, though she wondered if anything about this journey could truly be called easy. She had ridden horses as a child, but that had been decades ago, and her body was already protesting the unfamiliar demands of staying balanced in the saddle, while her mind grappled with questions that had no comfortable answers. The first hour of riding passed in relative silence, with Jake ranging ahead and back like a scout reporting on conditions that only he could interpret. The trail wound through foothills covered in aspen trees, whose leaves had turned the brilliant gold that marked autumn's brief but spectacular presence in the high country. The air was thin and clean, carrying scents of pine and wild grass that spoke to something primitive in Lucinda's soul. a recognition of beauty that existed independent of human interpretation or approval. "Tell me about the day he died," she said finally, her voice carrying across the morning quiet with the weight of a question she'd been preparing to ask for hours. Elias was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd heard her, or if the question had touched on memories too painful to access easily. When he finally spoke, his voice held the careful neutrality that people used when discussing events that had carved permanent scars on their hearts. "It was a Tuesday," he began. "Early morning, just after sunrise. Jake had been restless all night, pacing around the cabin like he knew something was wrong before the rest of us did. Dogs have a way of sensing things that haven't happened yet, especially when those things involve the people they love. The trail had begun to climb more steeply, and Lucinda could feel her horse's breathing change as the animal adjusted to the increased effort. Below them, the valley where Dry Hollow nestled looked like a child's toy village, complete and perfect and impossibly distant from the wild country they were entering. Jacob had been having a good spell, Elias continued. 3 weeks without nightmares, sleeping through the night, working on a carving project that had been giving him pleasure. I thought maybe he was finally healing, finding some kind of peace with the things he'd seen and done. What changed? A letter arrived. I'd been to town the day before for supplies, and the postmaster had asked me to deliver it. It was from the Veterans Administration, something about benefit adjustments and paperwork that needed updating. The kind of bureaucratic nonsense that usually just annoyed him. Elias paused to let his horse drink from a small stream that crossed the trail, its water so clear that Lucinda could see individual pebbles on the bottom. Jake lapped at the water enthusiastically, then shook himself in a spray of droplets that caught the morning sunlight like scattered diamonds. But this letter was different, Elias continued. It mentioned that his family had never claimed his personal effects, that there were items in storage that the army was required to return to next of kin. It listed you by name, Lucinda, with your address in Dry Hollow. That's when Jacob realized that all these years you'd been living just 3 hours away, believing he was dead. The revelation hit Lucinda like cold water, sudden and shocking in its implications. For 6 years, she had been driving the same roads, shopping in the same stores, living the same routine, while her brother existed in the mountains so close that they were breathing air from the same weather systems. The geography of her grief had been measured in miles that could have been crossed in an afternoon, but had instead become an unbridgeable distance because of secrets and shame and love that had twisted itself into a shape that resembled its opposite. "He could have come home," she whispered, more to herself than to Elias. "All those years, he could have just walked down the mountain and knocked on my door." "That's what I told him," Elias said. But Jacob's war wasn't the kind that ended when the shooting stopped. He was fighting battles that existed only in his mind, against enemies that lived in his memories. He couldn't see past his own guilt to understand that love doesn't require perfection, just honesty. They had reached a saddle in the ridge where the trail leveled out temporarily, offering views in all directions that took Lucinda's breath away. The world spread below them like a map, drawn by someone who understood that beauty and wilderness were the same thing expressed in different languages. But the spectacular scenery couldn't distract her from the growing realization that her brother's story was even more tragic than she'd originally understood. What happened after he got the letter? He spent the morning reading it over and over, like he was trying to decode some hidden message that would tell him what to do next. Then he took Jake and went for a walk, said he needed time to think. They were gone for hours, longer than usual. When they came back, Jacob seemed calmer, like he'd made some kind of decision. Elias's horse nickered softly, and Jake appeared on the trail ahead, tail wagging as if he were encouraging them to continue their journey toward whatever revelation waited in the cabin that had been home to secrets too heavy for any one person to carry. We had dinner together that night. Talked about ordinary things, the weather, the coming winter, a family of foxes that had been denning near the creek. Jacob seemed almost peaceful, more like his old self than I'd seen him in months. I thought maybe the letter had somehow freed him, given him permission to stop carrying guilt that had never belonged to him in the first place. But you were wrong. I was wrong, Elias confirmed. I found him the next morning, sitting in his favorite chair by the window that faced east toward Dry Hollow. He'd written a letter for you, pages and pages explaining everything. The crash that was supposed to kill him, the years he'd spent in the mountains, the reasons he'd never come home. The letter that would have answered every question you're asking now. Lucinda's horse stumbled slightly on a loose rock, and she had to grip the saddle horn to maintain her balance. The physical jolting seemed to echo the emotional impact of Elias's words, each revelation shifting her understanding of events she'd thought were fixed and comprehensible. Where is the letter? That's what we're going to the cabin to find out, Elias said. Because when I found Jacob that morning, the letter was gone. And the only one who could have taken it was Jake. The final approach to the cabin required them to dismount and lead their horses up a trail so steep that Lucinda wondered how Jacob had managed to carry building materials to this remote location. Each step upward felt like a small victory against gravity and doubt, her legs burning with the effort of climbing. Terrain that belonged more to mountain goats than to middle-aged librarians who spent their days surrounded by books, rather than boulders. Jake had grown increasingly excited as they climbed, his pace quickening and his tail wagging with the enthusiasm of a creature returning to familiar territory after a long absence. He would run ahead 50 yards, then circle back to check on their progress, his brown eyes bright with anticipation that was both infectious and heartbreaking. This was a homecoming for him, Lucinda realized, a return to the place where he had learned to love a broken man and had offered the only kind of healing that some wounds could accept. Just around this bend, Elias called back to her, his voice carrying a mixture of encouragement and warning. But Lucy, before we get there, I need you to understand something. This cabin holds 6 years of Jacob's life, including the parts he couldn't share with anyone. Some of what you're going to see might be difficult to accept. Lucinda paused to catch her breath, her hand resting on a boulder that radiated the kind of ancient patience that mountains possessed in abundance. Below them, the trail they had climbed disappeared into forests that looked untouched by human influence, while above them, peaks scraped the sky with the indifferent grandeur that had intimidated and inspired humans for millennia. I've been preparing myself for difficult truths all my life, she replied, though she wondered if any amount of preparation could actually equip someone for the reality of discovering that grief was more complicated than loss, and love more persistent than death. Whatever Jacob was dealing with, whatever he became, he was still my brother. That doesn't change just because the story is harder than I expected. Jake had disappeared around the bend in the trail, and his excited barking echoed off the canyon walls like a celebration that had been waiting 6 years to begin. The sound drew them forward with an urgency that made their tired muscles irrelevant, pulling them toward a reunion that had been postponed by shame and sorrow, and the terrible arithmetic of survival in a world that demanded more from some people than they had to give. When they rounded the final curve, Lucinda stopped so abruptly that her horse bumped into her from behind, nearly knocking her off balance. The cabin that appeared before them was not the rough mountain shelter she had expected, but a work of craftsmanship that spoke to years of patient attention and considerable skill. The logs had been fitted together with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered, especially when those details were the difference between comfort and misery during long mountain winters. Windows faced in 3 directions, the glass clean despite months of abandonment, and a wide porch wrapped around 2 sides of the structure, with the kind of generous proportions that invited long evenings spent watching weather systems build and dissolve among the peaks. A stone chimney rose from the center of the roof, its masonry work showing the same attention to function and beauty that characterized the entire structure. He built this himself? Lucinda asked, her voice filled with wonder at the evidence of capabilities she had never known her brother possessed. "Every log, every stone, every board," Elias confirmed. "Took him 3 years to get it exactly right, but Jacob always was particular about things he cared about. Said if he was going to live somewhere, it might as well be somewhere he could be proud of." Jake had bounded onto the porch and was scratching at the front door with the persistent enthusiasm of a dog who knew that home lay just beyond a barrier he couldn't overcome on his own. His whining carried a note of frustration that tugged at Lucinda's heart. The sound of a creature who had returned to the place where he belonged, but couldn't access the memories and comfort it represented. Elias produced a key from his pocket, its metal worn smooth by years of handling, and fitted it into a lock that turned with the well-oiled ease of hardware that had been maintained with care. The door swung open with barely a creak, revealing an interior that took Lucinda's breath away with its combination of simplicity and warmth. The main room was larger than she had expected, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and handcrafted furniture, arranged with an eye for both comfort and function. But what captured her attention immediately were the wooden carvings that filled every available surface. Bears and deer and mountain lions, birds in flight and fish swimming upstream. An entire wilderness preserved in pine and oak and cherry wood that had been shaped by hands that understood the essence of wild things. Jake bounded into the cabin and immediately began a circuit of the room, sniffing at corners and furniture with the intensity of a creature reacquainting himself with scents that held emotional significance beyond human comprehension. He paused at a chair by the east-facing window, whining softly as he placed his front paws on the seat cushion and peered out at the valley below. "That was Jacob's favorite spot," Elias said softly. "He'd sit there every morning with his coffee, watching the sun come up over Dry Hollow and thinking about the people he'd left behind. Sometimes he'd talk to Jake about you, tell stories about when you were children. Wonder what you were doing on that particular morning." Lucinda approached the chair with the reverence of someone entering a shrine, her fingers trailing over wood that had been polished smooth by years of use. The view from the window was spectacular, a sweeping panorama of valleys and ridges that included, somewhere in the distance, the small cluster of buildings that represented everything Jacob had loved enough to leave behind, rather than risk contaminating with his own brokenness. On a table beside the chair lay a pair of binoculars, their lenses clean and their focus set for distance viewing. Lucinda picked them up and looked through them, adjusting the focus until the landscape leaped into sharp detail. With the magnification, she could actually make out individual buildings in Dry Hollow, the church steeple, the water tower, even the roof of the library where she had spent 20 years tending to other people's stories, while never suspecting that the most important story of all was being written in a cabin less than 20 miles away. "He could see the town from here," she whispered, understanding flooding through her with the force of revelation. "All those years he was watching over us. Every day," Elias confirmed. He kept track of the changes, new buildings, different cars parked in familiar places, the rhythm of a community going about its daily business. Sometimes he'd use the binoculars to watch the cemetery on Sunday afternoons, knowing you were there putting flowers on his grave. The image was almost too much for Lucinda to bear, her brother sitting alone in this beautiful, isolated place, watching through lenses as she performed the weekly ritual that had given structure to her grief, but had never brought her closer to the truth of his continued existence. The cruel irony of it made her chest tight with an emotion that was part sorrow and part rage at circumstances that had conspired to keep them apart. Jake had moved to a corner of the room, where a wooden chest sat beneath a window, its surface carved with the same intricate detail that characterized all of Jacob's work. The dog was pawing at the chest with increasing urgency, whining and looking back at Elias and Lucinda as if trying to communicate something of vital importance. "What's he trying to tell us?" Lucinda asked, though she suspected she already knew. Elias crossed the room and knelt beside the chest, running his hands over its carved surface with the familiarity of someone who had seen it opened many times before. The lid was secured with a simple brass latch, but his fingers hesitated over the mechanism as if opening it would release forces that couldn't be controlled once they were set free. "This is where Jacob kept the things that mattered most to him," Elias said. "Letters from home, photographs, the carving tools that belonged to his grandfather, and the projects he worked on during his good days when the future seemed possible instead of impossible, including the letter he wrote to me. If Jake brought it back here after Jacob died, this is where it would be." Elias looked up at her, his weathered face serious with the weight of what they were about to discover. "But Lucy, you need to understand that opening this chest means opening the last chapter of Jacob's story. Once we know what's inside, we can't unknow it. Are you ready for that?" Lucinda looked around the cabin that had been her brother's refuge and prison, taking in the evidence of a life lived with careful attention to beauty and detail despite isolation and pain. The wooden animals seemed to watch her with carved eyes that held the same patient wisdom that had characterized Jacob even as a boy. The understanding that some things were worth waiting for, even when the waiting stretched beyond all reasonable limits. Jake sat beside the chest, his tail wagging slowly as he looked up at her with brown eyes that seemed to hold not just canine devotion, but something approaching human hope. This dog had been Jacob's confessor and companion through 6 years of healing and struggle, had witnessed the private battles that no human had been allowed to see, had been trusted with secrets that were about to be revealed or remain buried forever. "Open it," Lucinda said, her voice steady with the kind of courage that came from finally understanding that some truths were too important to leave hidden, regardless of their cost. The brass latch opened with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the cabin. Jake's tail had stopped wagging, and even the mountain wind outside had stilled, as if the entire wilderness were holding its breath in anticipation of secrets that had been kept for 3 months and 24 years, respectively. Inside the chest, carefully arranged on beds of soft cloth, lay the accumulated treasures of a man who had found ways to create beauty even in exile. Hand-carved wooden toys that would have delighted children, a rocking horse no bigger than Lucinda's palm, a set of farm animals so detailed she could see the grain of individual feathers on the chickens, a chess set carved from different woods, each piece a miniature work of art that would have taken dozens of hours to complete. But it was the collection in the bottom corner of the chest that made Lucinda's breath catch in her throat. A family of human figures, carved with such care and attention that she recognized each one immediately, despite their stylized simplicity. A tall man with a beard, their father, as he had been before the mine accident that took his leg and his optimism. A woman with gentle hands folded in her lap, their mother before illness had claimed her strength. And 2 children, a boy and a girl, standing close together with their arms around each other's shoulders. "He carved our whole family," she whispered, lifting the figure of the little girl and marveling at the way Jacob had captured something essential in the tilt of her head, the slight forward lean that had always marked her eagerness to be included in whatever adventure her older brother was planning. "He worked on those during his first winter in the cabin," Elias said softly. "Spent months getting every detail right. Said it helped him remember who he used to be before the war changed everything." Jake had climbed partially into the chest, his nose buried in the bottom corner where something wrapped in oiled cloth lay beneath the wooden figures. He whined softly, pawing at the package with the careful insistence of a creature who knew exactly what he was looking for and why it mattered. Lucinda set down the carved family and reached for the wrapped object, her fingers recognizing the familiar texture of her brother's handwriting, even through the protective cloth. The package was heavier than she expected, substantial enough to contain more than just a letter, and tied with string that showed the careful attention to detail that had characterized everything Jacob touched. "This is it," she said, though the words were more statement than question. "This is what Jake brought back from wherever Jacob went to die." Elias nodded, his weathered face grave, with the understanding that they were about to cross a threshold from speculation into certainty, from hope into whatever reality Jacob had chosen to leave behind. Jake disappeared for 2 days after Jacob passed. I searched everywhere, thought maybe he'd gotten lost in his grief or gone off to die the way some animals do when they lose their people. When he came back, he was carrying that package in his mouth, protecting it like it was the most precious thing in the world. Lucinda's hands trembled as she untied the string, her heart racing with the anticipation of finally hearing her brother's voice after 24 years of silence. But when the oiled cloth fell away, what she found was not just a letter, but an entire collection of correspondence. Dozens of pages covered in Jacob's familiar handwriting, some fresh and others yellowed with age, as if he had been writing to her for years without ever sending the letters. The top sheet was dated just days before his death, written in the careful script that had once earned him praise from teachers who admired his attention to penmanship. "My dear Lucy," it began, and the simple salutation hit her like a physical blow, carrying all the affection and regret of a lifetime compressed into 3 words. Jake whimpered softly and pressed his warm body against her legs, offering the kind of comfort that didn't require words or explanations. The dog seemed to understand that they had reached the moment when years of questions would finally find their answers, when the careful fiction that had sustained one woman's grief would be replaced by the complex truth of a love that had survived war, separation, and death itself. "Read it aloud," Elias said gently. "Jake has been waiting to hear Jacob's words as much as you have. I think he needs to know that the message he carried back got to where it was supposed to go." Lucinda looked down at the dog, whose brown eyes held such patient trust, then back at the letter that represented her brother's final attempt to bridge the distance that shame and sorrow had created between them. Around them, the cabin waited in perfect stillness, as if the walls themselves were prepared to witness the completion of a story that had been 24 years in the telling. With hands that no longer trembled, Lucinda began to read the words that would finally bring Jacob Bell home. "My dear Lucy," Lucinda began, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to flow down her cheeks. "If you are reading this, then Jake has done what I trained him to do, bring my words back to the people who needed to hear them. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me for the years I stole from us, but I need you to understand why I made the choices that kept us apart." The afternoon light streaming through the cabin windows seemed to grow brighter as she read, as if Jacob's words were somehow drawing illumination from the mountain air itself. Jake had settled at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes alert and focused on her face, as if he were listening not just to the sound of her voice, but to the emotional undertones that carried the weight of 24 years of separation. "The helicopter crash that was supposed to kill me happened exactly as the army reported," she continued, her brother's familiar voice seeming to speak through her own. "But I survived, badly injured and alone in jungle that belonged more to nightmares than to any world I'd ever imagined. For 3 weeks, I lived on rainwater and whatever I could forage, slowly healing from wounds that should have been fatal." Elias sat quietly in the chair by the window, his weathered hands folded in his lap as he listened to words he had never heard but had waited 3 months to witness being spoken. His eyes held the particular satisfaction of someone who had carried a burden for too long and was finally able to set it down in the right place. "When I finally made it back to base camp, the war was over for me in every way that mattered. The army processed my medical discharge, gave me my Purple Heart, and sent me home to a world that felt more foreign than the jungle I'd left behind. I tried to come back to you, Lucy. I sat in a bus station in Denver for 6 hours, holding a ticket to Dry Hollow, trying to find the courage to show up at your door." Lucinda paused, overwhelmed by the image of her brother so close to coming home, but unable to cross the final distance that separated them. She could picture him in that bus station, 24 years old and carrying wounds that were invisible but no less real than the scars that marked his body. "But I couldn't do it," she continued reading. "I couldn't bear the thought of you seeing what the war had made of the brother you remembered. I was having nightmares that made me violent in my sleep. I couldn't stand sudden noises or crowds of people. I'd wake up screaming about things I'd seen and done, and things that would have horrified you if you'd known the details." Jake lifted his head at the sound of her sob, pressing his warm nose against her hand in a gesture of comfort that seemed to carry all the gentle healing that dogs brought to human sorrow. The simple contact steadied her enough to continue reading the letter that was both confession and love song, apology and explanation. "So I came to the mountains instead, and thinking I'd stay just long enough to get my head straight before coming home to you. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and before I knew it, years had passed without me finding the courage to face the family I'd left behind." The letter went on to describe the cabin's construction, the slow process of learning to live with memories that never quite healed, the gradual discovery that solitude could be both medicine and poison, depending on how it was applied. Jacob wrote about watching Dry Hollow through binoculars, about the Sunday afternoons when he'd seen her small figure moving through the cemetery, about the guilt that had grown heavier with each passing year. "I want you to know that every wooden animal in this cabin was carved with love for you," she read through tears that made the words blur and dance on the page. "Every sunrise I watched from this window was a prayer that someday I'd find the strength to come down the mountain and ask for your forgiveness. Every night that Jake curled up beside my bed was a reminder that love doesn't require perfection, just presence." The final paragraph was the hardest to read, not because the words were difficult to decipher, but because they carried the weight of a man's final attempt to make peace with choices that had defined his hidden life. "I'm leaving this world the same way I've lived, in it for 6 years, quietly without fanfare, in a place where the mountains can witness what no human should have to see. But I'm not leaving alone. Jake will be with me, and through him, you'll know that every day I spent in these mountains was also spent thinking about the sister who deserved better than a brother." Too broken to come home, Lucinda set down the letter with hands that shook with the enormity of finally understanding the full scope of her brother's love and sacrifice. Around them, the cabin held the silence of a sanctuary, where prayers had been answered and burdens finally shared with the people who had always been strong enough to carry them. Jake looked up at her with brown eyes that seemed to hold not just canine devotion, but something approaching human understanding, as if he knew that his long journey was finally complete. 3 weeks later, Lucinda stood in the Dry Hollow Cemetery on a Sunday afternoon that felt different from all the Sunday afternoons that had come before it. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across headstones that had marked loss for generations. But today those shadows seemed less heavy, more like gentle reminders than permanent barriers between the living and the dead. Jake sat beside her, his warm presence a comfort that had become as familiar as breathing in the days since their return from the mountain cabin. The townspeople had grown accustomed to seeing them together, the librarian and the dog who had belonged to her brother, though few understood the full story of how that companionship had been forged in the crucible of revelations that changed everything, while changing nothing that truly mattered. The headstone bearing Jacob's name remained exactly as it had always been, the carved letters deep enough to last through weather that would outlive everyone who remembered the man they commemorated. But now Lucinda could read those letters without the crushing weight of incomplete knowledge, without the hollow ache of questions that had no answers. The stone marked not just death, but the place where love had chosen to build a monument that would outlast grief itself. In her hands, she carried fresh flowers as she had every Sunday for 24 years, but also something new, a small wooden carving of a dog that Jacob had made during his final winter, completed just weeks before his death. Jake the dog watching over Jake the carved memorial, a circle of devotion that required no explanation beyond the simple fact that some bonds transcended the ordinary boundaries of life and death. "I brought someone to meet you," she said to the headstone, her voice carrying the conversational tone she had always used during these weekly visits. "Though I suspect you two are already well acquainted." Jake's tail wagged gently, and he sniffed at the flowers with the polite interest that well-mannered dogs showed for human rituals they couldn't quite understand, but recognized as important. Then he settled beside the grave with the contentment of a creature who had finally delivered a message he'd been carrying for 3 months and could now rest in the satisfaction of duty completed. Walk back to town took them past the schoolyard where children were playing the eternal games that every generation discovered anew. One of the boys, the same freckle-faced child who had greeted Elias on that first morning, ran to the fence and called out to Jake, who responded with the gentle dignity that had made him welcome in every corner of Dry Hollow's peaceful community. "That's a good dog you got there, Miss Bell," the boy said, with the straightforward appreciation that children brought to animals they recognized as kindred spirits. "My grandpa says he's probably got some stories to tell if dogs could talk." "He does indeed," Lucinda replied, scratching behind Jake's ears with the automatic affection that had developed between them. "More stories than most people would believe." The library was quiet when they returned, filled with the golden afternoon light that made even the most ordinary books look like treasures waiting to be discovered. Margaret looked up from her cataloguing work with the smile that had become familiar since Lucinda's return from the mountains. Curious, but patient, understanding that some stories required time to be told properly. "Any interesting visitors today?" Lucinda asked, settling Jake on his favorite blanket behind the circulation desk. "Elias Boone stopped by," Margaret replied. "Left something for you on your desk, said to tell you it was from Jacob's collection." On her desk, Lucinda found a small wooden box, its surface polished smooth by years of handling. Inside, nestled in cloth that smelled faintly of pine and mountain air, lay a chess piece, a carved queen with a face that bore an unmistakable resemblance to their mother. A note in Elias's careful handwriting explained that Jacob had been working on a complete chess set during his final months, each piece representing someone important to his life. The queen was to be a gift for Lucinda, recognition of the role she had played in keeping their family's memory alive through 2 decades of patient tending. But more than that, it was Jacob's acknowledgement that she had been the strongest piece on the board all along, the one who could move in any direction and protect what mattered most. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains that had sheltered her brother's hidden life, Lucinda sat by her kitchen window, with Jake at her feet and the wooden queen on the table beside them. The town of Dry Hollow settled into its familiar evening rhythm, porch lights coming on, families gathering for dinner, the comfortable sounds of a community that had learned to find peace in routine and neighbors, and the kind of small kindnesses that made civilization possible. Tomorrow would bring new visitors to the library, new stories to be preserved and shared, new questions from townspeople who had heard rumors about the mountain man and the dog, and the secrets that had been carried in wooden boxes and faithful hearts. Lucinda would answer what she could, protect what needed protecting, and continue the work that had given structure to her days for 20 years. But now she understood that her real work had never been about books and cataloguing and the quiet preservation of other people's stories. Her real work had been about love that persisted across impossible distances, faith that survived the absence of evidence, and the kind of devotion that could transform a weekly ritual into a bridge strong enough to carry a brother home after 24 years of wandering in wilderness, that existed as much in the human heart as in any geographical location. Jake sighed contentedly and settled deeper into sleep, his legs twitching slightly as he dreamed whatever dreams came to dogs who had loved 2 masters and lost them both to different kinds of wars, but had learned that love itself was stronger than loss, more persistent than grief, and patient enough to wait as long as necessary for the right moment to reveal itself in all its complicated, beautiful, heartbreaking glory. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, covering Dry Hollow in the kind of pristine white that made the world look new and full of possibilities that hadn't existed the day before.